They showed up on a Tuesday morning while I was on duty. Two men in polo shirts and a woman with a clipboard, standing at the gate of our ranch like they owned the place. My wife Linda called me, voice shaking. She said the woman, the one with the clipboard, had told her she had 72 hours to remove our horses, tear down the barn we'd been building for 8 months, and pay a $2,000 fine. She told Linda, "Your husband can't protect you from this. Nobody can." I told Linda to stay calm. I told her I'd be home in 30 minutes. What that woman with the clipboard did not know, what none of them knew, is that the badge on my chest said Harmon County Sheriff, and by the time I was done with them, they would wish they had never set foot on my property. My name is Dale Harmon. I've been in law enforcement for 22 years. I've worked homicide, I've run narcotics investigations, and I've sat across the table from people who thought their power was untouchable. I know what intimidation looks like. I know what it sounds like. And I know exactly how to dismantle it. Linda and I bought the Crestwood Pines property 6 years ago. 11 acres on the edge of the Crestwood Pines planned community, a semi-rural HOA development in Central Texas that advertises itself as ranch-style living with community standards. That phrase, community standards, is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and we would learn that the hard way. When we bought the property, we did everything right. We hired a real estate attorney. We read the CC&Rs, all 47 pages. We asked specific questions about livestock, outbuildings, and agricultural use. The CC&Rs were clear. Properties of 8 acres or more were designated agricultural-residential, which permitted horses, fencing, and accessory structures, including barns, subject to county permit approval. We had 8 acres of usable land. We were in the clear. Or so we thought. We moved in April. Linda started a small cutting horse operation. 3 horses, nothing commercial, just her passion. We broke ground on the barn in February of last year. We had county permits. We had a licensed contractor. We had everything documented. Then, in late spring, Crestwood Pines elected a new HOA board. The new board president was a man named Victor Stanhope. Victor had moved into the community 3 years prior from a suburb outside of Houston. He had no agricultural background. He had no legal background. What Victor did have was a very strong opinion about what the neighborhood should look like, and a remarkable tolerance for wielding a little bit of authority over people who had done nothing wrong. Within 60 days of taking office, Victor had hired a private property compliance company called Sentinel Community Enforcement, a contracted firm that the HOA paid to patrol the neighborhood, issue notices, and, as I would later document, intimidate residents into compliance without due process. We got our first notice in June. It was a yellow envelope, the kind with the plastic window, left wedged in our gate latch. The violation was listed as unapproved accessory structure under construction, potential zoning non-compliance, immediate cessation of construction required pending board review. I came home from a double shift, read it, and set it on the kitchen table. Linda looked at me. I said, "We have every permit. This is noise." I wrote a certified letter to the HOA the next morning. I included copies of our county building permit, our contractor's license, a site survey showing our acreage, and the relevant section of the CC&Rs confirming our agricultural-residential designation. I sent it return receipt. 2 weeks passed. We received a second notice. This one escalated. It added a $500 fine for failure to respond to initial violation notice. It was dated 4 days before the response deadline I had been given in the first notice. They had fined us before our response was even due. I went to that board meeting. Victor Stanhope sat at the head of a folding table in the community center with 2 other board members on either side of him. There were maybe 20 residents in plastic chairs. I sat down, waited for the floor, and when my name was called, I stood up. I walked them through, calmly, politely, every document we had. County permit, site survey, CC&R section, Certified mail receipt showing my response was delivered within the deadline. Victor looked at my stack of papers for about 4 seconds. Then he looked up at me and said, "Mr. Harmon, the board has determined that the agricultural-residential designation requires additional board approval for structures over a certain square footage. We're applying that interpretation going forward." I said, "Can you show me where that interpretation exists in the CC&Rs? He said, "That's the board's position." I said, "That's not what the document says." He said, "The board has the authority to interpret the CC&Rs. I sat down. I took notes. I did not argue further at that meeting, because I already knew what I was going to do. Over the next 6 weeks, I submitted 3 formal written requests for the board's specific written interpretation, citing the exact section they claimed to be relying on. I requested their legal authority for the $500 fine given the timeline discrepancy. I requested the meeting minutes from the session where Sentinel Community Enforcement had been hired and a copy of the contract. They provided none of it. Instead, in late July, they sent a letter informing us that the fine had increased to $1,200 due to continued non-compliance, and that if we did not cease construction and remove the partial barn structure within 30 days, they would pursue a lien against the property. I contacted a real estate attorney. Her name was Patricia Vance. She had spent 15 years handling HOA disputes in Texas. Within 48 hours of reviewing our file, she told me, the fine timeline was procedurally invalid under the Texas Property Code. The HOA had no documentation supporting their alternate interpretation, and the Sentinel enforcement contract, which I had since obtained through a public records request, showed that Sentinel was operating under a performance incentive structure. They received a percentage of fines collected. Let me say that again. The company the HOA hired to patrol the neighborhood and issue violations was paid more when they fined more residents. Patricia sent a formal demand letter to the HOA and to Sentinel Community Enforcement. It laid out the procedural violations, the invalid fines, and put them on formal notice that we would be pursuing legal action for harassment and abuse of the CC&R enforcement process if this did not stop immediately. Victor's response was to schedule a compliance inspection. On a Tuesday morning in early August, while I was on a 12-hour shift, a Sentinel compliance officer, a man named Brent, according to his lanyard, along with a woman who identified herself as the HOA's community liaison and Victor Stanhope himself, showed up at our gate. Linda was outside near the paddock. She walked over. The woman with the clipboard told Linda that they were there to document ongoing violations and that Linda needed to let them onto the property immediately or they would escalate to legal action. Linda told them she was not comfortable letting them onto the property without her husband present. The woman told her that was not her choice to make. Victor said, and Linda wrote this down immediately after, "Your husband can file whatever he wants. That doesn't stop this. Nobody protects you from the HOA." Linda came inside, called me, and waited. I drove home in my patrol vehicle. I was still in uniform. I want to be clear about something. I did not go home to intimidate anyone with my badge. I went home because my wife was being threatened on our property by people who had no legal right to be there. I went home as her husband. I pulled through the gate and parked. Victor, the Sentinel officer, and the community liaison were still standing outside the fence line. I stepped out of the vehicle. I watched Victor's face go through about 4 different expressions in 2 seconds. I walked over, introduced myself calmly, and asked if there was something I could help them with. The Sentinel officer, Brent, started to hand me a violation sheet. I looked at it. I handed it back. I told him that this matter was currently under formal legal dispute as of a demand letter sent by our attorney of record, that they had been so notified, and that any further communication was required to go through counsel. I then told Victor, politely, professionally, that this was private property, that they had not been granted access, and that if they did not leave voluntarily, I would have to document the incident as a potential trespassing situation. Victor said, "You can't do that. This is HOA enforcement." I said, "I understand that's your belief, but I'm going to ask you one more time to step back behind the county road easement." They left. Patricia filed suit in county court. The claims included procedural violation of the Texas Property Code.
Chapter 209 governing HOA enforcement, bad faith fine escalation, and a demand for full fine reversal and attorney's fees. During discovery, we obtained the full Sentinel enforcement contract. We obtained Victor Stanhope's internal board emails, which showed he had specifically targeted properties he personally found aesthetically objectionable. There were emails about our barn that had nothing to do with CC&R compliance and everything to do with the fact that Victor didn't like looking at a working ranch from his back porch. The case never went to trial. The HOA's insurer pushed hard for settlement. In the end, the HOA agreed to dismiss all violations and fines against our property with prejudice, meaning they could not be refiled, pay our attorney's fees in full, terminate their contract with Sentinel Community Enforcement, and issue a formal written clarification to all residents affirming the agricultural-residential designation and the rights that came with it. Victor Stanhope resigned from the board 30 days after the settlement was signed. The barn was completed in November. Linda's horses are doing just fine. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The HOA counted on us being overwhelmed. They counted on the fines being scary enough, the legal language being confusing enough, and the process being exhausting enough that we'd just comply. That playbook works on a lot of people. It almost worked on Linda that Tuesday morning. But paper beats arrogance every single time. Document everything. Know your CC and RS, know your state law. And when someone tells you that nobody can protect you, sometimes the answer is already standing right there in front of them.